She stood on her porch, my own daughter-in-law, and told me to leave or she would call 911. For a moment, the years I spent helping them buy that house flashed in my mind. My hands felt cold, my chest tight, as if all the sacrifices I made had been thrown away. I walked back to my truck, but my heart stayed frozen at her door. What I decided to do next would turn their world upside down, and mine as well. I was standing on the front walk, holding the folder against my chest, when Brielle opened the door. Her eyes flicked to the papers in my hands, then back to my face like she already knew why I was there. Without a pause, she said I needed to leave. If I stayed, she would call 911. Behind her, Evan leaned against the hallway wall, arms crossed tight, staring at the floor. He did not say a word. The smell of vanilla candles drifted out the door, mixing with the sound of a TV playing somewhere in the house. I had been in that living room more times than I could count, helped pay for the very roof over their heads, and now I was standing outside like a stranger. I felt something cold press down in my chest. My hands, stiff from the years, gripped the folder harder than I meant to. I glanced at Evan again, hoping for even a small word to ease the blow. Nothing came. Brielle's stare never wavered. She was not yelling, but the way she stood made it clear she meant every word. I turned away slowly, my boots crunching on the walkway gravel. My truck sat at the curb, the late morning sun bouncing off the hood. I opened the door and sat inside for a moment, the heat already building in the cab. I set the folder on the passenger seat, stared at the papers sticking out from the top. Bank statements, loan documents, every proof I had that their home was tangled in debt they could not see or would not admit. The house behind me had its curtains drawn on the front windows. I imagined them closing tighter the second I drove off. My mind flickered to the night we celebrated Evan signing the mortgage papers, how Brielle had walked me through each room with that bright smile. It felt like a lifetime ago. I took my phone from my pocket and found Trevor's number. His voice came through clear when he answered. I told him I needed a current market analysis for a property. When he asked the address, there was a long pause before I said it out loud. He didn't comment, just told me he would run the numbers and get back to me by the end of the day. As I hung up, the phone buzzed again in my hand. Deputy Mira was confirming that, if needed, she could handle a service of documents within the week. I told her I would let her know. My own voice sounded strange to me, steady but without warmth. I started the truck and eased away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, the front door still half open, Brielle's silhouette barely visible in the frame. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past manicured lawns and driveways, with kids' bikes tipped over in the sun. My mind was a steady line of thought now, no spikes of anger, no rush of panic. By the time I reached the main road, I had already mapped the rest of my day. Get home. Pull the original purchase documents from the filing cabinet. Review the mortgage terms I had signed alongside Evan. Check the status of my lien. Every step was clear. At a stoplight, I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. The skin was lined, the knuckles broad from years of work, but they were still steady. I thought of all the nights I had stood in the depot office, managing routes, dealing with delays, keeping things on track no matter what came up. This was no different. When I turned onto my street, the sight of my own front porch was like stepping into another life. My house was quiet, the air cool inside. I set the folder on the kitchen table next to the small wooden bowl where I kept my keys. That bowl had been a gift from Evan when he was 10, a shop project from school. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making a list. Call Trevor again after I reviewed the numbers. Set an appointment with Cassidy to go over legal options. Check with the bank on any activity tied to my name. If you have ever felt the ground shift under your feet, share it when someone you love pushes you away. You know the mix of hurt and clarity that follows. That was where I was standing now. The hurt was real, but so was the path forward. And sometimes, the only way to keep what matters is to step back from the door that just closed and start moving toward the next one. I pulled the old metal chair out from the kitchen table and sat down with the legal pad still in front of me. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I set my pen down for a moment and let my mind drift back to the years when every decision I made was about keeping my family steady. I could still smell the diesel and engine oil from the depot. Nights blurred into mornings back then. I worked double shifts more often than not, moving between the office and the loading bays, sorting schedules, answering radios, keeping the buses running. My hands were always rough, my back tight from leaning over desks and hauling boxes of parts when we were short on staff. When my wife passed, I told myself I would not let the life we built slip through Evan's fingers. I kept working long after I could have retired. Every dollar I saved had a purpose. The biggest part came from the life insurance. $90,000 sitting in my account, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Evan and Brielle found a small brick house on the edge of Pula. It was not fancy, but it had a solid roof, a fenced yard, and enough room for them to grow into. The price was $335,000. They did not have the down payment the bank wanted, and Evan's credit was stretched from years of paying for trade school and tools. I remember sitting across from the loan officer, the scent of paper and toner in the air, and sliding my check across the desk. 90,000 down to give them a start. While we were there, I had them add a family mortgage for 55,000 in my name. Cassidy, a local real estate attorney I trusted, explained it clearly. It was a formal lien, recorded alongside the main mortgage to make sure my stake was protected. Evans signed next to me without hesitation. Brielle's smile was wide that day. She walked me through the empty rooms after closing, pointing out where they would put the couch, the dining table, the big TV Evan wanted. Those first few months, I visited often. I brought over tools to help Evan hang shelves, adjust the doors that stuck in summer. Brielle made coffee, and we would sit in the kitchen talking about their plans. I thought back then that we were building something together. The seasons turned, and my visits grew less frequent. They were busy, and I did not want to be in the way. The calls became shorter, more about surface things. I noticed small changes when I stopped by. A new gaming console in the living room. A trip they took to the beach. I never said much. I assumed they had it under control. It was Henrietta, my neighbour, who brought me pie one evening and asked if I had been over lately. She was gentle about it, but she had noticed how quickly they seemed to be buying things. She told me to keep an eye on my own footing. Her words stayed with me, even if I did not act on them right away. Now, sitting at my table, I realized just how far things had shifted without me seeing it. I pulled the file from the cabinet. Inside were copies of the purchase documents, the mortgage statement from last quarter, and the original lien papers Cassidy had drawn up. The ink of our signatures was still sharp. I could remember the weight I felt lifting when the loan officer stamped everything as complete. Back then, the worry I carried was that Evan might struggle to make the monthly payments. I never considered the possibility that someone would treat the house as a line of credit to drain. The last time I had been inside before this morning was over the holidays. The rooms were full of noise, the table crowded with food. Brielle barely spoke to me, but I told myself she was just tired from hosting. I gave them both envelopes with gift cards, trying to keep the connection alive. I had no idea then how deep into trouble they were. As I sorted through the papers, The faint ring of the phone in my memory pulled me back to the afternoon a few weeks ago when the bank called. They had reached my number by mistake, while trying to verify a payment for a line of credit tied to the Pooler address. That was the first crack in the surface. I set the documents in a neat stack, lined the edges against the table. Years of working with schedules and manifests made me value order. It was easier to think when everything was straight. The numbers in front of me told a story, one I could no longer ignore. Outside, the sun shifted, casting light across the kitchen floor. I thought of the early mornings at the depot, the smell of coffee in a styrofoam cup, the hum of the vending machine. I had lived by routines, and those routines had carried me through the worst of times. Now they would carry me through this. I closed the folder, slid it back toward the center of the table. The past could not be changed, but it could remind me of why I had to act now. Every dollar, every hour I had given was meant to keep that house secure for them. If they could not or would not do it, then I would. And this time, I would make sure no one could turn the key against me again. I started with the number on the notice and called the bank from my kitchen table. The morning light cut across the laminate, bright and unforgiving, the way good light exposes dust you thought you had already cleaned. A woman from customer care answered first, took the address, and after a few transfers, I was speaking with a compliance specialist named Phoebe Lang. Her voice was level and slow, the kind of neutral tone people use when they live inside rules. I gave her the Pooler address and my name. She asked for the last four of my social and the date the mortgage closed. I read those numbers off the folder. Papers slid against each other as I turned the pages, and the sound steadied me more than I expected. Phoebe said she was looking at a home equity line tied to that property. She listed a credit limit and a balance that matched the figure on the notice in my mail, 47,000. Then she said she did not see a co-owner consent form on file. Her words were exact. For this kind of lien, any recorded co-owner must acknowledge. She paused long enough for the meaning to land. The record shows a family mortgage in your name, she added, recorded alongside the primary mortgage at purchase. Without a signed consent from you, this HELOC is out of policy and flagged for review. The air in my kitchen shifted. I could hear the refrigerator compressor turn off, a soft click that left the room even quieter. I asked for next steps, and Phoebe explained what her department would do. She would escalate to the internal risk team, place a hold on any further draws, and open a file for the title insurer to review. I wrote each step on my legal pad in block letters. Hold on draws, risk review, title notice. She confirmed my mailing address twice, then said I should expect written follow-up within 7 business days. She did not sound angry or sympathetic. She sounded like a metronome. It calmed me in a way I needed. When the call ended, I set the phone down and walked to the sink. The window over it looks onto my small side yard and a pecan tree that has been slow but faithful. I ran water over a glass and stood there while it filled, listening to that steady stream. I had spent a lifetime believing that steady work and steady rules would carry a person through anything. That belief had not left me. It had only been waiting for the moment I would need it again. Before I could take a drink, my phone buzzed twice on the table. A text from Evan came in first. A short message that asked me to keep things quiet until he could talk to Brielle. He said she was stressed and on edge about money, that he wanted to smooth it out with her. There was a pleading tone beneath the lines, even though he did not use many words. A second buzz brought an email notification. It was from Brielle. She had sent a photo of a new bag on their kitchen counter with a caption about treating herself after a hard week. The shine on the leather caught the overhead light in a way that told me it was not cheap. I felt the distance between my house and theirs stretch another foot. I did not answer either message. Instead, I rinsed the glass and called the appraiser Trevor had recommended the year before when I helped a friend sell a condo. His name was Liam Durand. He picked up on the second ring and said he could swing by the Pooler house that afternoon if he could get access, or he could do a drive by exterior and pull comps immediately with a full interior scheduled later. I told him to begin with the exterior and comps, to move quickly and send me his estimate as soon as he had it. He said he would email a preliminary figure by early evening. I thanked him and wrote his name and the time down beneath the notes from Phoebe. While I waited, I pulled the family mortgage from the folder and read it again slowly. The language was dense and dry, but the intent was simple. The lien in my name had been recorded at the same time as the purchase. It existed not as a theory, but as a fact in the county books. That line on paper felt like a handrail on a narrow staircase. You still have to climb, but at least you can keep your footing. By mid-afternoon, Liam sent the email. His preliminary number for market value was 418,000. He attached a short grid with 3 nearby sales and notes on condition and location. He wrote that interior condition could move the needle a little in either direction, but that the range would hold. I read it twice, printed it, and slid it into the folder with the others. 418 felt like the sound of a door latch clicking. A thing either catches or it does not. This caught. The house was not a stock portfolio or a game token. It was a place where 2 young people were supposed to build some roots. But numbers are not the enemy. They are a map. The number from Liam told me there was still room to protect the foundation under that roof if I moved with care. The number from Phoebe told me someone had pulled credit out of the walls without my consent. Together they formed a path I could follow without getting lost in anger. I stepped outside for air and walked the slow loop of my block. The heat off the pavement lifted around my ankles. A boy 2 houses down was practicing basketball in his driveway. The ball thumped a rhythm against the backboard, then the concrete, then the backboard again. It sounded like the depot clock used to sound to me, marking time in a way the body remembers. I rounded the corner and headed back to my porch, with my legs a little looser and my breathing even. Inside, I spread everything out on the table again. The purchase statement, the family mortgage, the text from Evan left unread, the email from Brielle with the bag, Liam's estimate. I did not need to guess at motives or reconstruct every choice they had made. The paper trail was enough. I took a pen and drew a simple ladder down the left margin of the legal pad. Each rung got a task. Confirm title position, freeze further draws, engage counsel, file notice to protect interest, request market analysis from Trevor as a second opinion. The phone rang near 5. It was Cassidy. I gave her the summary in the same steady way Phoebe had given me hers. She listened, then asked me to bring the original family mortgage and the latest bank notice to her office first thing in the morning. She said she was prepared to draft a notice that would stop any transfer or refinance until consent issues were resolved. I felt a muscle in my shoulder unclench. The day had started on a front walk with a closed door. It was ending with a plan that did not need anyone else to approve it. When we hung up, I put the folder back together and closed the cover. The sun had dropped behind the pecan tree, and the kitchen had gone soft and copper-coloured. I made a simple dinner and ate it standing up like I had done on late shifts for decades. After the dishes were dried and put away, I set my keys on the wooden bowl and turned off the light. Tomorrow I would carry the folder into Cassidy's office and set it on another table under another bright lamp. Tonight I let the house settle around me and trusted the small sounds it made. Some things hold even when the ground feels like it is moving. The trick is to find those points and keep your weight there until morning. I parked on the street, 2 houses down from Evan and Brielle's place. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass, and the faint sweetness of someone's grill warming up. I left the engine off and sat for a moment, my hands resting on the folder in the passenger seat. It was thinner than it had been a few days ago, just the essentials now, clipped in the order I needed them. When I stepped out, the sound of a dog barking somewhere nearby carried down the block. My shoes crunched over the gravel edging their driveway as I walked to the door. Brielle answered after the second knock. She wore a loose sweater and leggings, her hair pulled up, and her eyes went straight to the papers in my hand. I told her we needed to talk. She moved aside just enough for me to step into the kitchen. The smell of brewed coffee hung in the air, mixing with something faintly metallic, like a pan just taken off the stove. Evan was sitting at the small table near the back window, a mug in front of him, both hands wrapped around it. He looked up briefly, then down again. I set the folder on the counter and opened it to the top document, a copy of the home equity line statement. The balance was printed in bold at the top. I slid it across to where Brielle could see it. She glanced down, then back up at me. Her face did not change much, but there was a small tightening around her mouth. "This is tied to your house," I said. "It was opened without my consent." I had her look at the date, the account number, and the absence of my signature on the consent line. I turned the page to the next document, the recorded family mortgage, with my name and Evan's side by side. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorway to the hall. "That does not prove anything," she said. "You have never liked me. You just want to cause trouble." Evan shifted in his chair, his eyes moving between us, but not settling anywhere. I told her the bank had already flagged the account for review, that further draws were frozen, and that the title insurer would be looking at the lien position. She pushed the papers back toward me, the edges of the pages curling slightly under her fingers. "You are blowing this out of proportion," she said. "We make our payments. The house is fine." I took a slow breath. "Payments are fine until they are not," I said. "You have other credit lines against this place, and they all take from the same well." I reached into the folder and pulled out the statement for the second mortgage. I set it next to the HELOC statement. Side by side, the numbers told their own story. Her eyes flicked over the figures, but she did not reach for the papers. Instead, she stepped to the counter, poured herself coffee, and stirred it slowly. Evan had not spoken yet, so I looked at him and asked if he had known about the HELOC. His shoulders lifted and dropped in a small motion, more like a sigh than an answer. "We needed it for some things," he said finally, still looking down at his mug. "It was easier to do it that way." "Without telling me," I said. "Without considering that my name is on the title." Brielle set her cup down with a small clink. "You put your name there to control us," she said. "That was never about helping." I did not answer her right away. Instead, I gathered the papers back into a neat stack, tapping the edges against the counter. Years of working with manifests and timetables had made me value clean edges, even in moments like this. I slipped the documents back into the folder and closed it. "I came here to show you what I found," I said, "and to give you a chance to talk about it. You have made it clear where you stand." Brielle picked up her coffee again and leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on the window over the sink. Evan's hands tightened on his mug, the skin over his knuckles pale. I could see the weight of the moment in the slope of his shoulders, but he said nothing more. I took the folder under my arm and walked toward the front door. The house felt different from when I had first stepped inside. The air seemed thicker, the sounds sharper. Each footstep on the tile and then the carpet felt louder than it should. At the door, I turned the knob slowly. Behind me, Brielle's voice carried across the short space between us. "If you keep pushing this, you will regret it," she said. I paused with my hand on the door, but I did not turn around. I opened it, stepped outside, and let it close behind me. The sound of the latch clicking was as final as I had expected. Walking back to my truck, I noticed the small weeds growing between the driveway slabs, the kind of detail that creeps in when attention shifts elsewhere. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the lawns. Inside the cab, I set the folder on the seat beside me and started the engine. The hum of it filled the quiet. I backed out slowly, the tires crunching over the same gravel they had touched earlier. As I pulled away, I kept my eyes forward. The drive home was short, but long enough for the exchange to replay in my head. The flatness in Brielle's tone, the absence of surprise in Evans, the refusal to even look closely at the documents. All of it told me I had been right to move forward with Cassidy, with Trevor, with the plan already forming in my notes. When I reached my own driveway, the pecan tree in the side yard was throwing its shade across half the front lawn. I parked, picked up the folder, and went inside. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that lets you think. I set the folder on the table and pulled out the legal pad. I drew a line under the last entry from yesterday and wrote in steady letters, "Showed evidence, no cooperation, proceed with legal steps." The kitchen light caught the edge of the folder as I closed it again. The day's work was done. The next move would not be made in their kitchen. It would be made where the words on paper carry more weight than words over coffee, and I was ready for that. The next morning I was in the courthouse parking lot before 8. The air was cool for Georgia, the kind of air that carries the faint smell of damp concrete and paper. I carried the folder under my arm, the legal pad tucked inside. The main entrance doors were heavy glass, and as I stepped through, the sound of my shoes on the tile echoed down the wide hallway. The clerk's office sat halfway along the corridor. Inside, the counters were lined with stacks of manila files, and the low hum of printers filled the space. Behind the counter, Clerk Daniel Probst looked up from a screen. He was the kind of man who moved with efficiency, but never seemed rushed. He greeted me, asked for the address of the property, and pulled up the case template on his monitor. His tone was even, almost mechanical, as he laid out the timeline. 5 days for service of process. 30 days for a formal response from the other parties. If no response, a default judgment would be entered. If there was a response, the case would be set for a hearing within 60 days. He slid a single sheet across the counter, a printed summary of the schedule. I read it, then folded it once and put it in the folder. The neatness of the steps calmed me. This was not about emotion here. It was about process, about documents moving from one desk to another until an outcome was reached. When I stepped back into the hallway, the fluorescent lights cast a pale wash over the marble floors. Deputy Mira Alvarez was waiting near the elevators, a thin stack of papers in her hand. She had the same steady demeanor as the last time I had spoken to her. She confirmed that she could handle service on both Evan and Brielle within the week. She would deliver the documents in person and file the affidavit of service with the clerk. We walked to a quieter corner of the hallway, and she flipped through the pages to show me where the court's seal had been affixed. Her finger tapped the date at the top. "Once this is served, the clock starts," she said. Her voice carried no weight beyond the facts. That was what I needed. After leaving the courthouse, I drove across town to meet Trevor. His office sat in a small strip of commercial buildings, sandwiched between a tax service and a notary. Inside, framed photos of properties lined the walls. He already had a printed market analysis on his desk when I arrived. We went through it page by page. Recent sales in Pula, properties with similar square footage and lot size, adjustments for age and condition. His conclusion matched Liam's earlier figure closely. 409,000 for a quick sale, possibly a little higher if marketed aggressively. But given the circumstances, he said, speed might be more valuable than squeezing out the last few thousand. I nodded, made notes in the margin of the printout, and slid it into the folder with the others. Trevor said he could have a photographer ready within 48 hours if we moved forward, and he knew buyers who would consider a purchase without contingencies. Back at my kitchen table, I spread out the timeline from Daniel, the service plan from Mira, and the market analysis from Trevor. The pieces fit together with a kind of precision I had relied on all my life. It reminded me of setting a bus schedule in the old depot days, when each route had to line up with the others so passengers could make their connections. One slip, and the whole system suffered. The afternoon was spent on the phone with Cassidy. She had drafted the lis pendens, the legal notice that would be filed with the county recorder. It would alert any potential buyer, lender, or title company that there was a pending legal action affecting the property. In practical terms, it froze the ability to sell, refinance, or otherwise transfer ownership without resolving the dispute. Cassidy's voice was measured as she read sections of the notice aloud. She asked me to confirm the legal description of the property, the parcel number, and the recording information for the original mortgage and the family mortgage. I had all of it in the folder. Each time she asked, I turned to the right page and read the details. By the time we hung up, the notice was finalized and scheduled to be filed first thing in the morning. Cassidy would deliver a copy to Mira so it could be included with the service documents. That way, Evan and Brielle would receive it at the same time as the court summons. As evening settled, I stepped out onto my porch. The street was quiet, the last of the daylight sliding off the rooftops. I thought about the conversation in their kitchen 2 days ago, the way Brielle had pushed the papers back across the counter, the way Evan had avoided my eyes. That moment had closed the door on any informal resolution. The steps I had taken today opened another door, one they could not close with words. Inside, I cleared the table and stacked the documents in the order they would be needed next. At the top was the timeline from Daniel. Beneath it, the service plan from Mira, then the market analysis, then the lis pendens. The legal pad sat on top of everything. The day's date written in the upper corner, a short list of completed tasks below. I wrote one more line at the bottom. Tomorrow, file notice, serve documents, start the clock. Then I set the pen down, closed the pad, and rested my hand on the cover for a long moment. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room. In the quiet, I could hear the faint creak of the house settling, a sound I had always found reassuring. It reminded me that some structures hold steady no matter what storms pass outside. All they need is a solid foundation and regular care. That was what I was building now. A framework of actions, each one linked to the next, each one carrying the weight it needed to. The time for conversations over coffee was past. The time for schedules, filings, and official seals had begun, and I was ready to follow it through to the end. Cassidy's office was quiet when I arrived the next morning. The reception area smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and a single desk lamp glowed in the corner. She met me at the doorway to her office, a legal pad under one arm, her reading glasses resting halfway down her nose. I set my folder on her desk and took a seat across from her. She opened it and went straight to the family mortgage document, running her finger down the recording information. The date and book number were clear. She looked up and said that this lien had been recorded before the HELOC, which meant my position was ahead of it. She pulled a large county plat book from her shelf and flipped to the property page. The sequence of filings told the story. Primary mortgage, family mortgage in my name, then the HELOC much later. In legal terms, my lien had priority. Cassidy explained what that meant in practical steps. In any sale, refinance, or foreclosure, my lien would have to be satisfied before the HELOC. It was not just a note in a file, it was leverage. She suggested we contact the title insurer directly. If they wanted to cure the defect in the HELOC, they might be willing to contribute money to close the gap. She picked up her phone and called a contact named Stefan Koenig. She introduced herself, outlined the sequence of liens, and handed me the receiver when he asked to confirm my understanding of the situation. Stefan's voice was smooth, deliberate. He confirmed that the absence of my consent on the HELOC created a title defect. To protect their client and themselves, they could offer a payment to me in exchange for waiving any claim against the title policy once the property sold. He suggested $12,500 as a cure amount. I wrote the figure in the margin of my legal pad, circled it twice. When I handed the phone back, Cassidy was already making notes. She said this cure could be folded into the closing process if we reached that stage. It would reduce the outstanding HELOC balance and simplify the path to a sale. From there, the conversation shifted to options. Cassidy outlined two parallel tracks. The first was the partition sale we had already set in motion. The second was a foreclosure on my family mortgage. Filing both would create pressure from two sides. Often, she said, the prospect of a foreclosure alongside a partition was enough to bring the other party to the table. I asked about the timing. She said the foreclosure notice could be prepared within a week. If we moved on both fronts, the legal deadlines would overlap, making it harder for them to stall. I could see the framework forming, like the old depot schedules when I would line up inbound and outbound runs so the timing locked together. Before I left, Cassidy advised I keep all communication with Evan and Brielle to a minimum. Let the filings speak. Every word I said to them now could be used to distract or delay. I understood. This was no longer a matter of persuading. It was about positioning. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table and went through the notes. The priority lien, the cure payment from Stefan, the dual legal tracks. Each was a rung on the ladder I was building. I wrote them out in sequence, then checked them against the court timeline from Daniel. Everything fit without overlap or wasted motion. The phone buzzed in the afternoon. It was Trevor. He had just finished showing a property similar to Evan and Brielle's to a cash buyer. He believed this buyer might be interested if our sale went ahead quickly. I told him to keep the line warm, but not to make promises yet. A little later, I got a call from Stefan's office confirming the cure offer in writing. The email arrived within minutes, a formal letter on company letterhead, outlining the defect and the proposed payment. I printed it, slid it into the folder between the family mortgage and the HELOC statement. Seeing it there made the numbers feel less abstract. As the light faded, I thought about the day. The knowledge of the lien's priority shifted something in me. It was not just that I had rights on paper. It was that those rights were backed by a sequence of dates and filings no one could rewrite. In all my years, I had learned that the order of things matters. In a depot, you cannot send a bus out before the passengers arrive. In property, you cannot skip over a recorded lien just because it is inconvenient. I walked out to the porch with a cup of coffee, the evening air cooler now. The street was quiet except for the hum of a lawnmower 2 houses down. I let the stillness settle before going back inside. On the table, the folder waited, its contents in perfect order. At the top was the family mortgage, beneath it the cure letter, then the HELOC statement, then the market analysis. These were no longer just pieces of paper. They were tools. And like any tools, they needed to be used at the right moment, in the right sequence, to get the job done. Tomorrow would bring the next set of filings. For tonight, it was enough to know the foundation was stronger than I had thought. And in any fight over a structure, the one with the better foundation usually wins. 2 mornings after my meeting with Cassidy, the for sale sign went up in front of Evan and Brielle's house. Trevor had arranged it, and the metal post was set deep in the ground, the white panel swinging lightly in the early breeze. A smaller red strip read, "By appointment only." The photographer was due that afternoon, but Trevor said he already had buyers lined up to see the listing the moment it went live. I drove by without stopping, slowing enough to take in the quiet of the street. A delivery van was parked 2 houses down. A neighbor was out with his dog, glancing from the sign to the house. Even without words, curiosity travels fast in neighborhoods like this. Back at my own kitchen table, I opened the folder and laid out the documents in sequence again. Priority lien, cure payment offer, market analysis, lease pendants, court timeline. They formed a map that pointed in one direction. The pieces were no longer just potential moves, they were already in motion. By midday, Trevor called to say the first 2 showings had been scheduled for later in the week. One was a young couple moving from out of state, the other an investor group looking for rental properties in Pula. Both were cash buyers. The news was still on my mind when my phone lit up with Evan's name. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was quieter than usual, carrying a weight I recognized from years of hearing men talk when they were holding something back. He asked if I could meet him behind his shop during his lunch break. I drove over, pulling into the gravel lot. He was leaning against the back wall, hands in his pockets, head down. When I got out of the truck, he looked up, and for a moment the guarded expression I had seen in their kitchen was gone. He told me he had done something he was not proud of. A few weeks ago, before I learned about the HELOC, he had pawned his wedding ring to cover one of Brielle's credit card bills. He had not told her yet. He said it felt like the only way to keep her from taking another draw against the house. His voice was flat, not defensive, just tired. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I understood the instinct to protect what mattered, even if the method was flawed. But I also told him that protection built on silence was a temporary fix at best. He nodded, eyes fixed on the gravel between his boots. When I left, I thought about that ring. Not its value, but what it represented. It was another sign of how far the ground had shifted under them, and how desperation had replaced planning. It made me even more certain that the course we were on was the only one left. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Cassidy. Attached was a copy of the official service affidavit from Mira. Both Evan and Brielle had been served with the summons, the lis pendens, and the supporting documents. The clock was now ticking. They had 30 days to respond. That same evening, Phoebe from the bank sent a brief update. The HELOC account was still frozen, and the title insurer had confirmed receipt of the cure agreement. The numbers were holding. 2 days later, Trevor called again. He had a new buyer inquiry from another investor, also cash. The listing had only been live for a day, but the combination of location and price point was drawing quick interest. He said the market was leaning in our favor, and that speed might be our strongest ally now. The activity around the sale was one side of the story. The other was the reaction it stirred. Word must have reached Brielle quickly after the sign went up. That Friday evening, I saw her car parked outside Trevor's office when I drove past on my way home. Through the window, I could see her leaning across the desk, her hands moving sharply as she spoke. Trevor caught sight of me through the glass, but gave no sign, keeping his focus on her. The next morning, he called to tell me she had tried to persuade him to take down the sign, saying they had a private buyer lined up. He had reminded her of the lis pendens, the court action, and that no sale could proceed without my consent as co-owner. He said she left quickly after that. The resistance did not surprise me. In fact, I had been expecting it. What mattered was that the systems in place held firm. The legal filings, the notices, the recorded liens. They left no room for maneuvering outside the process. On Sunday, I received a brief voicemail from Evan. He said he had told Brielle about pawning the ring. There was no shouting in the background, no slammed doors, just his voice, quiet again. He ended the message by saying he would keep attending the meetings Nadine had connected him with. By the start of the next week, the first round of showings was complete. Trevor reported that both the out-of-state couple and the investor group were interested, with the investors likely to make an offer first. The investor group wanted a quick closing which fit our timeline perfectly. That evening, I sat at my table with the legal pad and added a new line under my ongoing list. Potential offer pending, maintain pace. The light outside was fading to that deep blue that comes before full dark. In the quiet, I thought about how quickly things had shifted once the filings were in place. For months, this had felt like a slow erosion. Now, it was like a current moving steadily toward a point that could not be turned. The for sale sign still swung lightly in front of their house, the red strip catching the afternoon light. Each swing marked time in its own way. The days were no longer measured by unanswered calls or stalled conversations. They were measured by scheduled showings, signed affidavits, and the narrowing distance between where we were and where this had to end. I moved into the short-term apartment the day after Trevor confirmed a serious offer was likely coming in. The place was on the second floor of a modest building near Forsyth Park, nothing fancy but secure and quiet. The parking lot was small, the stairwell smelled faintly of fresh paint, and the front door had a solid deadbolt. I carried in 2 suitcases, a box of files, and my coffee maker. Everything else stayed at my house, which I had locked down and left in the care of a neighbor who agreed to keep an eye on it. The apartment had just enough space for what I needed. A small kitchen, a living room with a worn but clean sofa, a bedroom with one window looking over the street. The simplicity suited me. It was a place without history, without the tension that had started to settle into the walls of my own home after months of conflict. That first evening, I set up the kitchen table as my work area. The folder came out, the legal pad next to it, and the laptop in the corner for checking emails from Cassidy and Trevor. From here, I could watch the process unfold without being a stationary target. Evan and Brielle would not know where to find me unless I wanted them to. By midweek, the apartment was already serving its purpose. Calls from Cassidy came without the undercurrent of background noise from my neighborhood. She updated me on the court timeline, no response yet from Evan or Brielle, which meant the default clock was still running. She also mentioned that Nadine had followed through on my request to connect Evan with regular GA meetings. He had attended 2 so far. That evening, I walked the few blocks to the park. The live oaks arched overhead, their branches heavy with Spanish moss swaying in the light breeze. Couples strolled past, joggers kept to the path, and the fountain in the center threw water into the fading light. I found a bench where I could sit and think without the constant pull of tasks waiting at home. The quiet was interrupted only by a call from Nadine. She told me Evan had spoken up at the meeting, something many newcomers took weeks to do. He had not mentioned the legal case, but had shared about the stress of debt and the choices it had led to. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the note of encouragement in it. Progress, even small, had weight. Back at the apartment, I kept to a simple routine. Mornings started with coffee and reviewing any new documents. Afternoons were for errands or walking in the park. Evenings for phone calls with Cassidy or Trevor. The physical distance from my house was giving me a different kind of clarity. I could see the path without the noise of familiar rooms and their memories. Midway through the week, an email from Cassidy confirmed that Mira had successfully posted the lis pendens notice at the county recorder's office. That single step meant any potential buyer or lender looking at the property would see the dispute immediately. It was another wall in place, keeping the process contained. On Friday, Trevor called to say the investor group had toured the property again and was preparing to make an offer. He kept his tone neutral, but I could hear the momentum in it. The market was still moving in our favor, and with cash on the table, the timeline could stay tight. That night, as I sat at the table in the apartment, the phone lit up with Evan's name. I let it ring through. The voicemail that followed was brief. He said he understood now why I had taken the steps I had, even if he wished it could have been different. There was no anger in his voice, only a tired acceptance. I closed the phone and looked at the neat stack of documents in front of me. Each page represented a deliberate move, each one necessary to reach this point. From the first conversation with Phoebe to the cure letter from Stefan, from the market analysis to the court filings, the structure was holding. The next morning, I woke early, brewed coffee, and stood by the window looking down at the empty street. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. I knew the next phase was close, once the offer came in and the court's deadlines passed. The shape of the outcome would be clear. Until then, I would keep my place here, above the street, out of reach from the noise and urgency of the other side. The distance was not just physical, it was the space needed to let the plan work without interference. And in that quiet, I could wait for the next step to arrive exactly when it was supposed to. The courthouse hallway was cool and quiet when I arrived that morning. I carried the same folder I had been adding to for weeks, its edges worn from being opened and closed so many times. Cassidy was already waiting outside the assigned courtroom, her own file in hand. She greeted me with a brief nod, then glanced at the clock. Inside, the room smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. The judge's bench was set high, flanked by the state flag and the stars and stripes. Evan and Brielle were seated at the table to the left, speaking in low tones. Evan's shoulders were stiff, his tie slightly crooked. Brielle sat perfectly straight, her eyes moving from me to Cassidy and back again. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The bailiff called the case, and we took our seats. Cassidy began with a clear outline of the matter before the court. She presented the family mortgage, the recorded dates, and the evidence showing my lien had priority over the HELOC. She described the lis pendens, the cure offer from the title insurer, and the current market value confirmed by multiple appraisals. Her delivery was calm and precise, each point supported by documents she handed to the clerk. When it was their turn, Brielle spoke first. Her voice was steady, but edged with strain. She said the situation had been exaggerated, that they were capable of making their payments, and that selling the house would cause them unnecessary hardship. She avoided specifics about the HELOC and the other loans, steering instead toward personal grievances. The judge listened without interruption, his eyes occasionally dropping to the papers in front of him. When Evans spoke, his tone was quieter. He admitted there had been financial missteps, but argued that they could be corrected without losing the property. I watched him glance toward me once, then away quickly. Cassidy requested permission to respond. She pointed to the 30 days that had passed since service of the summons without a formal response from them, noting that only the impending sale had prompted this appearance. She emphasized that my position as co-owner and lien holder gave me equal authority in decisions about the property's disposition, and that the law provided clear remedies when co-owners could not agree. The judge asked for the market analysis and reviewed it for a moment. His expression did not change, but the tone in his voice when he spoke again made it clear he had reached a decision. He granted the partition sale, authorized the listing to proceed under Trevor's management, and acknowledged the cure agreement as part of the final settlement terms. As he finished, I felt a small shift in the air around me. It was not relief exactly, but the weight of weeks of preparation settling into place. The process was now backed by a court order. Words and arguments were no longer enough to stop it. When the hearing ended, we gathered our documents and stepped into the hallway. Evan lingered near the door, his hands in his pockets. Brielle walked ahead without looking back. Cassidy suggested we head straight to her office to coordinate the next steps. There, she went over the order in detail. The buyer's offer would be submitted to the court for approval, and closing could occur as soon as the title work and cure payment were finalized. Trevor would coordinate access for inspections and the final walkthrough. By late afternoon, Trevor called with confirmation that the investor group was still committed. They wanted a closing date within 30 days. He said the momentum was on our side and that we should keep pressing forward. That evening, I returned to the apartment and set the court order on the table. The pages were thin, but carried the authority to move the process to completion. I thought back to the first time I had stepped into Brielle's kitchen with those early bank statements. Back then, everything was uncertain, every step met with resistance. Now the path was marked, and the steps ahead were clear. Outside the window, the streetlights came on one by one. I made a note on my legal pad. Order granted. Proceed to closing preparations. Then I closed the folder and let the quiet of the room settle around me. The day had been about making the case, but the weeks ahead would be about finishing it, and I was ready to see it through. 2 weeks after the hearing, the final days in that house began to run out. Trevor called to say the investor group had confirmed the closing date, and the court had signed off on the sale. The calendar page seemed heavier than usual as I circled the date in red. On the morning of the move, I drove past slowly. The driveway held a rented truck, its back door open to reveal boxes stacked unevenly and furniture wrapped in thin blankets. The for sale sign was still planted in the yard, but its red strip now read, "Pending." Through the front window, I could see Evan carrying a chair toward the door, his steps measured. Brielle came out behind him with a stack of flattened boxes, her hair pulled back, eyes fixed on the truck. Neither looked toward the street. That afternoon, Cassidy called to confirm the cure payment from the title insurer had been wired to the closing account. The figure matched what Stefan had promised, and with it, the HELOC balance would be reduced before the remaining proceeds were divided. The numbers were exactly as we had calculated. Primary mortgage paid, family mortgage satisfied in full, cure applied, and the balance split by ownership percentage. Closing took place in a conference room at a title office downtown. The walls were bare, except for a clock that ticked louder than necessary. Trevor arrived first, placing a slim folder in front of him. Cassidy came in a few minutes later, greeted the closer, and opened her file to the final settlement statement. The columns of numbers were clean, the deductions precise. When the documents were brought in, the closer walked us through each page. I signed where Cassidy pointed, each pen stroke steady. The family mortgage payoff was listed clearly, followed by the distribution line for my share of the net proceeds. The total was not a fortune, but it was the result of a process done right, backed by the law and completed without compromise. Halfway through, the door opened and Evan stepped in. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, a faint mark on his finger where the wedding ring had once been. He nodded toward me but said nothing. Brielle did not come. He signed the papers that required his hand, then sat quietly while the rest were completed. When the last document was signed, the closer gathered them into a neat stack and handed copies to each of us. The wire transfer for my portion would be completed by the end of the day. Cassidy slid my copies into the folder I had carried for months. It was lighter now, most of its purpose fulfilled. Outside, the air was cool and bright. Evan paused near the curb, his hands in his pockets. He told me they had found a smaller place on the other side of town. His voice was even, almost relieved, as if the weight of holding on to something too big had finally lifted. I wished him well, and we went our separate ways. Back at the apartment, I set the folder on the table and poured a cup of coffee. The clock on the wall marked the early afternoon, and the room was filled with a quiet that felt earned. I thought about the months behind me, the first sign of trouble in a misdialed bank call, the kitchen conversation with papers spread across the counter, the steady build of filings, deadlines, and court orders. The process had been about more than money. It had been about making sure 30 years of effort and planning were not wasted. It had been about refusing to be pushed to the edges of my own decisions. By the time the sun dropped behind the rooftops, the wire confirmation had arrived in my inbox. The numbers were exact, matching the final settlement sheet down to the cent. I closed the laptop and looked over at the folder. It would stay in the cabinet now, a record of what had been done and how it had been done. The day had ended with signatures and a deposit, but what mattered more was the line it drew under the entire matter. The house was no longer ours. The obligations were settled. The next steps would be mine alone to decide, without anyone else's hand on the keys. A week after the closing, the rhythm of my days began to settle into something I had not felt in a long time. The apartment, once a temporary shelter, started to feel like my own space. I kept the table by the window clear except for the coffee mug and the morning paper. The folder that had followed me everywhere was now stored in the cabinet, its contents untouched since the day of the wire transfer. Without the constant push of deadlines and filings, the quiet took on a different quality. It was no longer the stillness of waiting for something to happen, but the calm that follows when a long job is finished. I filled my time with simple things: walking to the park, cooking dinner without rushing, catching up on books I had set aside months ago. One afternoon, Nadine called to give an update on Evan. He was still attending meetings and had started helping set up chairs before they began. She said his tone had changed, less defensive, more willing to listen. There was no mention of Brielle, and I did not ask. Some gaps were better left alone. A few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The return address was from the title insurer. Inside was a final confirmation of the cure payment, along with a note of thanks for my cooperation in resolving the title defect. It was a small thing, but seeing the matter officially closed in their records felt like the last door shutting behind me. The neighborhood around the apartment began to feel familiar. The man at the corner store would nod when I came in for milk. The woman who walked her terrier past my building each morning had started to wave. These small exchanges reminded me that life moved forward in quiet, ordinary ways, even after months of upheaval. One morning, while walking through the park, I paused by the fountain. The air was cool, and the water rose and fell in steady arcs. I thought about how many decisions in the past months had been made from a place of necessity rather than choice. This moment felt different. The choices ahead were mine alone, unshaped by anyone else's debts or demands. Later that week, Cassidy invited me to lunch at a small place near her office. Over sandwiches, she asked how I was adjusting. I told her the truth, that it felt good to wake up without the weight of someone else's problems on my shoulders. She nodded, saying that most of her clients never got to this point without losing more than they gained. We parted with a handshake, the kind that closes one chapter cleanly. Back at the apartment, I looked at the space around me. It was still bare in places, but that suited me. I did not need to fill it with reminders of what had come before. Instead, I could let it stay open for whatever came next. The last pages of this chapter had been written in courtrooms, offices, and on the quiet streets between them. Now, the pen was back in my hand, ready for something new. The noise had faded, the pace was my own, and the road ahead, for the first time in years, was clear. A month after the closing, the apartment had taken on the feel of permanence. The few things I had brought with me fit neatly into the space. The days no longer carried the tension of waiting for court dates or the next call from Cassidy. Instead, they moved with an easy rhythm: coffee at sunrise, walks in the park, errands done without hurry. One morning, while reading the paper, I saw a small real estate notice. The house that had once been at the center of everything was listed as sold, the buyer recorded as the investor group Trevor had brought in. No mention of the months of filings, the late-night calls, or the careful stacking of evidence. Just a single word that marked the end of it. I folded the paper and set it aside. The history tied to that house was not mine to carry anymore. It belonged to someone else now, and with it went the arguments, the debts, and the constant edge of conflict. A few days later, Evan left a short message on my phone. He said they had settled into the smaller place and that things were calmer. There was no apology, no request, just a quiet acknowledgement. I let it sit without response. Sometimes silence was the clearest answer. The following week, Nadine and I met for coffee. She told me Evan was still attending meetings, even taking part in discussions. She didn't offer details beyond that, and I didn't ask. We talked instead about her garden, the early spring, and the way life had a way of settling into a new shape if you let it. That evening, I sat by the apartment window and watched the last light fade over the rooftops. The street below was calm, the air cool against the glass. The months behind me had been marked by conflict, strategy, and the steady defense of what was mine. Now the only thing left was the choice of how to spend the days ahead. I closed the curtain and turned off the light. The story that began with a slammed door and a warning to leave had ended here, in a quiet room, with the future unclaimed and waiting. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to think about the boundaries you've set to protect your own dignity. You can share this with someone who might need the strength to step away from what no longer serves them. Subscribe for more stories of resilience and renewal, and turn on the bell so you never miss a chapter. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story, where every calm choice carries weight, and every person deserves a place they can call their own.